The possession of knives was strictly forbidden, and the tool remained hidden within a hand-sewn inner pocket of my left trouser leg for many months. I was again stricken with acute diarrhea and was ordered to report to the clay-walled barracks that served as the camp clinic. Dr. Kohler from Heidelberg, who was later portrayed in the film The Doctor of Stalingrad, prescribed charcoal. Here I also saw for the first time large candy containers provided by the International Carita Charity Organization. These containers held vitamin B tablets marked with English writing. I was surprised to experience daily inspections in the clinic by a Russian major who was the camp physician. I referred to him as Gospodin Major, instead of the usual term tovarich, comrade. The title Gospodin was an old Russian term for lord or master, and using this term, along with a small gift of carved figures, pleased him immensely. I also presented him with a charcoal landscape sketch that delighted him. While being treated for the diarrhea that seemed to plague me continually, I was again placed into Work Group 3. In the pre-dawn hours, the Labour parties would depart on their assignments, and I was permitted to leave the camp unescorted to walk the short distance to the Russian barracks where the Major's room was located. In his simple room, I was allowed to copy illustrated instructions from a medical book printed in Vienna in 1900. I made brushes and pens from cattle hair obtained from nearby farms. The Major provided India ink in tiny dried cubes that had to be mixed prior to use, and small pieces of condensed colours were obtained from the paper mill, which enabled me to colour the drawings. The Gospodin Major then distributed these drawings to medical doctors located in neighbouring political clinics, which had been established as rest and recreation areas for the Soviet working classes. On New Year's Day 1948, a currency reform was initiated by the Soviet government. Mine workers from the Caucasus flocked to exchange markets on small horses and donkeys to trade large wads of paper currency for what they had previously exchanged for tobacco leaves and merchandise. Many found themselves arrested for illegal currency trading, despite their ignorance of having committed any crime. The workers, unknowingly committing a serious offence, were often sentenced to hard labour and dispatched to Siberian camps. These measures, undertaken by a government far away in Moscow, further alienated the population, who valued their independence from central authority. Among the patients in the camp clinic was Sepp Kartzer, a former paymaster from Augsburg. He eventually died from malnutrition. However, before his death, an order was received from Moscow requiring that all future deaths of prisoners of war be thoroughly investigated for cause. This measure was likely taken due to pressure from the International Red Cross. On the morning of Kartzer's death, several other prisoners and I were ordered to place his body in the back of a Studebaker truck. The German camp physician and Gospodin Major took their places in the cab of the vehicle, and we were ordered to ride in the back with the corpse. The driver then sped over rough paved roads towards Sochi, and we had to hold tight to Kartzer's body to keep it from sliding out of the open bed of the truck. Our destination was a horseshoe-shaped clinic situated in a grassy area. The building had 3 levels of large wooden verandas, and white-clothed medical personnel gathered to peer from the upper floors as we unloaded Kartzer's body from the truck. We carried his body into the building and laid him on a table, where we were immediately surrounded by doctors and nurses who gathered to witness the event as Dr. Kohler began the autopsy. During the process, the doctor made statements about his findings, which were noted by one of the attendants. I slipped out the door during this examination and explored the clinic grounds, where I soon discovered the kitchen. I was able to obtain a ration of kasha, which I ladled into my ever-present mess tin. A large well was located near the door of the kitchen, and in the nearby garden I found garlic and red peppers. I was stuffing handfuls of these delicacies into my bread bag next to my mess tin when I heard the call, "Wiedermann, Suda, voda nada." In response to their request, I grabbed a pail of water that was located just inside the kitchen door. Gospodin Major and Dr. Kohler proceeded to wash their hands in the pail following the operation, and Dr. Kohler then handed the pail to a medical assistant who was waiting nearby. The assistant walked to the kitchen door, tossed the water into the garden, refilled the pail from the well without rinsing it, and returned it, filled with water, to the kitchen without further cleansing. We soon departed with Kartzer in our custody. A large pink stain appeared on the middle of the white sheet that covered his body during our journey back to the camp. After we arrived, he was carried to a small hill where the camp cemetery was located and laid to rest among our other comrades who had perished as prisoners. Local inhabitants had told us that in 1917, prisoners of war had been incarcerated in the camp while building roads through the mountains, and that their graves were also located in this cemetery. With the changes in politics, it was ordered from Moscow that the graves of prisoners would be identified with their names. From Господин Major, I received a list of names of prisoners who had recently died, and we nailed together rough crosses, upon which I painted the names from the list, using paint mixed from chalk and kerosene. I was later able to smuggle the list of approximately 15 names hidden in the sole of my wooden shoe back to Germany, and the names were given to the Red Cross. Thus, a final explanation was provided for the fate of a tiny number of those listed as missing in the East. At length, Господин Major ensured that I was assigned to a small special camp near Gagrilovo. This camp, also under his responsibility, contained about 50 sick prisoners. An enormous work camp had been located in the shadows of the Caucasus nearby, and it had only recently been disestablished. It had been planned that prisoners would be concentrated at this location as labour for the construction of a massive hydroelectric dam. These plans had only recently been abandoned after consulting a team of German prisoners consisting of engineers and related technicians, including the geologist Vollrath from my hometown. After inspecting the site, they advised the Russians that the flow of water available, combined with the rate of evaporation in the warm climate, would never produce enough energy to power the turbines. A high commission from Moscow was dispatched to the scene, and the Russians then determined that an error in plans had been made. Thus, the power plant was to be constructed at another location. In the nearby mountains were large stores of equipment that were to have been used in the construction of the dam. One afternoon, I was sitting in front of the barracks filing a piece of aluminum into a comb, as I had begun to regrow my hair, which the Soviets had once required to be close-shaven. Господин Major passed by and, as usual, asked me how I was doing. "Nichevo plocho," I responded. "Why, you doing bad?" he retorted. "You very sick. You go home soon." And so it happened. In summer 1948, I was permitted to board a boxcar that was filled with approximately 40 prisoners for what was rumoured to be our final trip to freedom. The journey was said to have taken about 1 week. However, I was again stricken with severe diarrhea and raging fever. Lying weakly within the dark car, my condition seemed to worsen with each passing hour, and I was soon too weak to stand for more than a few minutes' duration. Through a feverish veil, I remained barely able to discern between daylight and dark, and was hardly able to comprehend the events taking place around me. At long last, we reached the border. We were herded from the rail car onto the parade ground of a military base on the banks of the Oder near Frankfurt, where we stood in ranks, the chill of an early morning penetrating the ragged bits of various, now obsolete uniforms that hung from our emaciated bodies. Silence hung heavy in the air as we stood motionless, painfully aware that freedom lay only hours, perhaps minutes away. Through burning eyes, I watched a Soviet officer, flanked by a guard with an ever-present submachine gun, pace slowly along the ranks of prisoners. We had been ordered to lay all possessions at our feet. The officer carefully examined each prisoner, then shifted his gaze to the meagre belongings piled onto threadbare Wehrmacht rucksacks and bread bags as he moved down the line. I shivered uncontrollably from the fever. However, my weakness was momentarily forgotten, as his expressionless gaze shifted from my face to my clothing, then concentrated on my sparse belongings piled at his feet. A sense of relief swept over me, and I attempted to still my pounding heart as he then turned and stepped to the next prisoner. Next to me stood Oberleutnant Hans Hirth from Reichenbach, a small town near my home in Stuttgart. The Soviet officer inspected Hans carefully, then looked at the belongings piled before him. He turned on his heel as if to move on, but hesitated and then stopped. Bending down, he picked up a small, crudely carved wooden box that Hans had fashioned from pieces of cedar in the camp. Examining the box curiously, he suddenly tossed it to the ground and brought his booted heel upon it, splintering the box and spilling the contents. Hidden within a false bottom was an iron cross that Hans had managed to conceal during more than 3 years of searches and inspections in captivity. The officer picked up the decoration, raised it slowly, and examined the object before looking at Hans. "Fascist!" he exclaimed loudly. 2 guards with rifles suddenly appeared from the perimeter. The officer snapped commands as he glared at Hans. They took positions on either side and pushed Hans forward, leading him away with shoves and unintelligible shouts. Hans glanced over his shoulder at me, his haggard face white with terror. "Tell my parents what happened!" he shouted desperately. Oberleutnant Hans Hirth did survive, and was eventually released from captivity many years later. The journey continued. With a high fever, I was transported through Saxony, and near Hofen der Saale we departed the Russian zone and crossed into Bavaria, bringing my 1,080 days of Soviet captivity to an end. In an ever-weakening condition and stricken with edema, I remained barely conscious as I lay for several weeks in a former military clinic in Ulm. The central area of this ancient city had been reduced to rubble by the heavy bombing raids, and the crests of ragged walls remained marked with wooden crosses to indicate where civilians lay dead beneath the ruins. Under the care of Red Cross nurses, I slowly regained my health, lying for many hours in the shadows of the clinic. I had returned to a world yet torn asunder, and I was determined to leave my past with its many horrors behind me. Despite my efforts, I remained lost in the weeks, months, and years of a past that I was resolved to forget. My thoughts wandered to comrades lying in unmarked graves, the enemy dead, and the overwhelming challenge of facing a changed world. It remained impossible to comprehend that the long ordeal was over, and that with so much death and destruction our world had witnessed, I had somehow survived. Contrary to my long-held expectations, there was no outpouring of emotion. I felt no elation with the slow realization of survival, only overwhelming emptiness when reflecting on the victims lost to the apocalypse. Of the 12 members of Gottlob Biedermann's anti-tank crew who marched into Russia in June 1941, 3 survived to return to their homeland. Gun Captain Gefreiter Biedermann, 22 years old, multiple wounds, 7. Surrendered the 8th of May 1945. Gunlayer Gefreiter Ola, 21 years old. Lost eye near Gaitolovo, September 1942. Discharged with severe wounds. Gunloader Gefreiter Albert, 21 years old. Multiple wounds, killed in action near Dunneburg, 1944. Munition handler 1, Gefreiter Spindler, 21 years old. Multiple wounds, killed in action south of Lake Ladoga, 1943. Munition handler 2, Gefreiter Eichler, 21 years old. Twice wounded, killed in action on the North Front, 1943. Munition handler 3, Obergefreiter Krenz, 29 years old. Severely wounded, Battle of Smerdenia, arm and leg amputated, 1943. Discharged with severe wounds. Munition handler 4, Oberschütze Wacker, 22 years old. Killed in action near Gaitolovo, 1942. Machine gun crew leader Gefreiter Hafner, 21 years old. Previously wounded, killed in action at the Parpatch position, February 1942. Gunner 1, Obergefreiter Brendel, 32 years old. Killed in action south of Lake Ladoga, 1943. Gunner 2, Oberschütze Einer, 19 years old. Killed in action on the North Front, 1944. Gun mover, Obergefreiter Fair, 35 years old. Killed in action near Dunneburg, 1944. Munition handler, Gefreiter Fahlteich, 35 years old. Killed in action on the North Front, 1943. We learned to scorn death, but to love life with fervour.